What if your entire bloodline, every ancestor who lived and died, every child you brought into the world, every choice you believed was entirely your own, was nothing more than a footnote in someone else's experiment? For more than 10,000 years, a sisterhood of women moved through the shadows of human civilization. Not as conquerors, not as rulers, but as architects, patient, invisible, and utterly ruthless. They call themselves the Bene Gesserit. And the project they were quietly running was the most ambitious genetic program in the history of the human species. This is the story of their records. The secret ledger written not in ink, but in blood and time and calculated manipulation. A ledger that tracked noble houses across generations, hunted recessive gene sequences like a prospector chasing ore, and pursued with absolute patience the slow, deliberate cultivation of a being who had never existed before, a being they called the Kwisatz Haderach. To understand what the sisterhood built, we need to go back to the beginning, back to an age of fire and broken machines. The Butlerian Jihad ended approximately 10,000 years before Paul Atreides was born. It was the great crusade against thinking machines, against the artificial minds humanity had allowed to dominate its civilization for generations beyond counting. When the last of those machines was destroyed and the silence finally settled, humanity was left standing in the wreckage with a profound and terrifying question. If we cannot use computers to manage the complexity of an interstellar civilization, then who will? The Bene Gesserit had existed before the Jihad in various forms as a school of extraordinary mental and physical discipline that trained women to levels of awareness most people never approached. But in the aftermath of the crusade, they recognized an opportunity, or perhaps a necessity, that would define their purpose for the next 10,000 years. If thinking machines were gone, humanity needed something to replace the processing power, the memory, the foresight those machines had once provided. Not through technology, but through biology. The sisterhood would cultivate a human being whose mind could hold the weight of deep time, whose prescient awareness could serve as a compass for the whole of the species. But a project of that scale, breeding for a specific convergence of traits across dozens of generations, required patience that most human institutions simply could not sustain. Empires rise and fall. Religions fracture. Political alliances dissolve within a single lifetime. The sisterhood needed a framework that could endure all of that and remain intact. So they built one. The first pillar of that framework was called the Missionaria Protectiva. On the surface, it was a program of religious seeding. Teams of Bene Gesserit sisters were dispatched to primitive and isolated cultures across the known universe to plant myths, prophecies, and religious expectations deep into local belief systems. The logic was elegant and ruthless. If a Bene Gesserit operative ever found herself stranded among a foreign people with no resources and no allies, the right words spoken at the right moment, the right performance of a predicted miracle could mean the difference between death and survival. But the Missionaria Protectiva was always more than a survival mechanism. It was the ideological scaffolding for the breeding program itself. The Kwisatz Haderach, when he finally arrived, would need to be received. He would need a people who had been waiting for him, a culture already primed to recognize and worship the kind of being he would be. The Fremen of Arrakis were one such culture, seeded over many generations with the legend of Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world, and the Mahdi, the one who would lead them to paradise. The sisterhood was not merely breeding a superhuman. They were constructing the entire world he would be born into. The second pillar was the genetic mandate itself. The Reverend Mothers, the most senior and powerful members of the order, had access to something called other memory. Through the ritual of the spice agony, the consumption of a lethal concentration of melange, a woman who survived gained access to the memories of every female line ancestor stretching back through the deep past. This was not metaphor or spiritual vision. It was a literal archive of lived experience carried in the biological memory of the cells, accumulated across uncountable generations and waiting to be unlocked. The Reverend Mothers understood from that accumulated ancestral knowledge exactly what the human nervous system was capable of, and exactly what it had never achieved. They could perceive the edges of what biology had so far produced. And they could perceive, in theory, what lay just beyond those edges, waiting to be unlocked by the correct genetic combination. Now, to understand the architecture of what they were building, we need to talk about what the Kwisatz Haderach actually was. The word itself comes from a Hebrew phrase meaning the shortening of the way. That name is precise in a way that reveals the full ambition of the program. The Kwisatz Haderach was conceived as a being who could be in two places simultaneously, or more accurately, a being whose prescient awareness could encompass both directions of time at once, past and future, without limit. Where a trained Reverend Mother could look backward through her female line ancestry and forward through probability space in limited ways, the Kwisatz Haderach would look both ways without obstruction. He would stand at the nexus of all human time and see clearly in every direction, but there was a biological barrier that had never been crossed. The spice agony worked differently in men and women. Women who underwent it and survived were transformed into something extraordinary. Men who attempted it died. Every single time, without a single exception in the historical record. The male nervous system, as it existed in the current human population, could not survive the transition. The sisterhood's theoretical argument was that this was not a fundamental limitation of male biology. It was a limitation of current male biology. With the right combination of recessive traits, the right convergence of bloodlines after sufficient generations of selective pressure, a man could be born whose nervous system was architecturally different enough to survive and channel the agony. Not simply survive it, but become something unprecedented. Something the women themselves could not become, because the female Reverend Mothers, powerful as they were, could not access their male ancestral lines through other memory. That corridor was closed to them. The Kwisatz Haderach would throw it open. The genetic logic was intricate and demanded extraordinary precision across a timescale that dwarfed ordinary human ambition. The sisterhood was not simply selecting for physical strength or intelligence or force of will, though all of those traits played a supporting role. They were hunting for specific recessive configurations that, when combined correctly after the right number of generations of concentration, would produce a nervous system architecture unlike any that had ever existed. The capacity for full prescience in a male body, the ability to access the complete human ancestral archive, not just the female line, and the psychic resilience to look into absolute time and not be shattered by it. Simpler ambitions have destroyed lesser organizations. To achieve this, the sisterhood needed raw material, and the raw material of their program was the genetic heritage of the great houses of the Imperium. The systematic infiltration of the noble bloodlines began almost immediately after the Jihad, and continued quietly and methodically for 10,000 years. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. The Bene Gesserit trained their adepts to make themselves indispensable. As advisors, as truthsayers, as concubines, as wives, as educators of noble children, Bene Gesserit sisters embedded themselves in every major house of the Landsrat across the known universe. They were trusted precisely because they appeared to have no ambitions of their own, no desire for land or title or political power, just devoted service. This appearance was, of course, the lie at the center of everything. Every child born of a Bene Gesserit mother or raised under a Bene Gesserit foster mother was potentially an asset. The sisterhood tracked these bloodlines across generations, maintaining what functioned as a living genetic database, updated with every birth and every death, every marriage, and every unexpected combination that appeared in the children of their placements. They knew which houses carried certain recessive traits. They knew which combinations had produced remarkable results in the past. They knew which noble families were genetically inert, the dead ends of the ledger, and which shone with latent potential. Two bloodlines stood above all others in the sisterhood's calculations: the Atreides and the Harkonnen. The Atreides were a house of extraordinary latent capacity. Their line carried a specific form of enhanced perception, a kind of intuitive awareness that in ordinary members of the house manifested as exceptional tactical intelligence or charismatic authority. Others called it the Atreides gift, without quite understanding what they meant by it. But in the sisterhood's genetic analysis, this gift was the surface expression of something far deeper, a nervous system predisposed toward the kind of extended awareness the breeding program was cultivating. Several Atreides women had become remarkable Bene Gesserit adepts over the centuries. The Atreides line was, in the sisterhood's assessment, one half of the genetic key they needed. The other half was the Harkonnen. Here the reasoning becomes deliberately uncomfortable. The Harkonnen were a house of brutality. Their historical record included exploitation and cruelty on a scale that made other noble houses recoil. Baron Vladimir Harkonnen was, by any measure, a man whose moral philosophy could be summarized as appetite without restraint or limit. And yet the Harkonnens carried something the sisterhood valued without sentiment, a ferocity of will, a capacity for violent determination that, when filtered through the right combination with Atreides sensitivity, might produce in a single individual something of terrifying and unprecedented force. The sisterhood did not admire the Harkonnen line. They found it dangerous, but they needed it. And so they worked it into their calculations with the same clinical detachment they brought to every element of the program. The breeding plan required the genetic heritage of both houses to converge. But the convergence had to happen at precisely the right moment, after the correct number of generations of selective pressure had concentrated the recessive traits into a sufficiently dense configuration. This was not something that could be rushed or approximated. Move too quickly, and the convergence would be incomplete. Wait too long, and the bloodlines might diverge in unpredictable directions that would require decades more of correction. Centuries became millennia, and the ledger grew. The sisterhood tracked every marriage, every illegitimate birth, every adoption within the target bloodlines. They arranged alliances that appeared politically motivated but were, in the genetic record, precision maneuvers. They guided women into relationships that seemed romantic or convenient while serving the program's deeper architecture. They used their truthsayer roles to steer negotiations in directions that kept the bloodlines advancing along the calculated path. Through all of this, the Reverend Mothers ran the projections. In their other memory, in the accumulated wisdom of their ancestral archive, they were modeling the genetic future across time. Each generation was a test. Each test refined the model. After thousands of years, the model had become extraordinarily precise. The generation that would produce the critical convergence was identified. The Atreides side of the equation required a daughter, a Bene Gesserit trained woman carrying the concentrated recessive potential of her line placed with the Duke of House Atreides, whose own heritage made him the ideal complement. The child of that union, a daughter, would carry in her the convergence of Atreides' potential and everything the sisterhood had been building across 10,000 years. That daughter would then be matched with a man from the Harkonnen line, and the child of that final union would be the Kwisatz Haderach. The plan was meticulous. The plan had one critical flaw. It required complete obedience from the woman at its center. Her name was Lady Jessica. She was a Bene Gesserit adept of considerable skill, illegitimate daughter of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen himself, though she would not learn that truth until much later. She was placed with Duke Leto Atreides as his bound concubine. The instructions were unambiguous. She was to bear him a daughter, and she loved him. That small, human, agonizing fact is the hinge on which the entire 10,000-year project swings. Jessica had the ability, as a trained Bene Gesserit, to choose the sex of her child. This was among the most carefully guarded biological arts the sisterhood possessed, requiring extraordinary concentration but achievable for any properly trained woman. Jessica knew her instructions. She had received them clearly. A daughter. The program required a daughter. But Leto Atreides, the man she loved, had lost a firstborn son in a tragedy years before and longed deeply for an heir. And Jessica, choosing love over 10,000 years of institutional planning, chose to give him one. That son was Paul Atreides. The Sisterhood's response to this deviation was complicated. Some within the leadership were furious. The meticulous genetic architecture had been disrupted by a single act of personal feeling. Others watched with something closer to cautious fascination, because the genetic convergence was still present in Paul. He still carried everything the program had concentrated across 10,000 years. The recessive traits were there. The Atreides sensitivity was there. The Harkonnen will was there. He was simply not supposed to be born yet. He was a generation early, and he was male, which meant the question of whether the convergence could manifest in a living male nervous system was about to be tested whether the Sisterhood was prepared or not. Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam, who served as the Emperor's truthsayer and who was also a senior operative deeply involved in the breeding program, assessed Paul with the Gom Jabbar, the poisoned needle test of consciousness over instinct, which measured whether a being could exercise rational control over primitive reflex under extreme pain and fear. Paul passed. But her assessment went beyond the test. Something in him pushed against the edges of what she understood, something that had not been on the projected timeline. She did not tell him what she suspected. The Sisterhood rarely shared what they knew. Now comes the Arrakis variable. And this is where the story moves from calculated science into something altogether stranger and wilder than 10,000 years of planning had anticipated. The desert planet of Arrakis was the sole source of melange in the universe. The spice extended life, enhanced consciousness, and made prescient interstellar navigation possible. It was the most valuable substance known to humanity. And it was also the environment most saturated by the Missionaria Protectiva. Generations of sisters had seeded Fremen culture with prophecy and primed them to receive a figure of transcendent importance. The myth was elaborate and carefully constructed over centuries. A man would come from the outer world. He would speak the words. He would lead them to freedom. He would be the Mahdi. When House Atreides was given governorship of Arrakis by the Emperor Shaddam IV, and when that political gift turned instantly into a trap, and the combined forces of the Harkonnen and the Imperial Sardaukar destroyed House Atreides in a single night of calculated betrayal, Paul and Jessica fled into the deep desert. They went to the Fremen, and there the variables that the Sisterhood had not fully modeled began to compound one upon another. The Fremen consumed spice constantly. It saturated their food, their water, their air. Their eyes ran blue within blue from a lifetime of total immersion in melange. The extreme physical demands of survival in one of the harshest environments in the universe had made them among the most physically conditioned people alive, and their culture, shaped over generations by Missionaria Protectiva myths, was psychologically primed to catalyze exactly the kind of transformation the Sisterhood had been preparing for. When Paul began drinking the spice-laced water of the Fremen, when he lived in the deep desert, when he faced genuine death repeatedly and survived it, something began to open in him that the breeding program had prepared but had not yet triggered. His prescient visions began as fragments, glimpses of possible futures, pathways branching and dissolving. But they grew with a speed that had no precedent in the Sisterhood's models. The desert was accelerating the process. The constant presence of concentrated melange, the pressure of survival, the activation of ancestral memory through the spice of the sietch, all of it was pushing the convergence harder and faster than any controlled setting the Sisterhood had ever designed could have achieved. Jessica, too, underwent transformation. She drank the water of life, the lethal exhalation of a drowned sandworm, the same substance Fremen Reverend Mothers used to achieve their own form of awakening. She had never been formally made a Reverend Mother through the Sisterhood's own ritual, but the Fremen version of the rite was, in its biological mechanism, identical. She survived the agony. She became a Reverend Mother in the desert tradition, and in doing so, she unknowingly passed something to the child she was carrying in that moment. Her daughter, Alia, was born already awake. A preborn in the Bene Gesserit terminology, a being with full adult consciousness from birth, with access to all of Jessica's ancestral memory from the very first moment of her existence. Something the Sisterhood considered deeply dangerous and called by one word only: abomination. The unintended consequences of one woman's act of love had cascaded outward into a shape no one had designed and no one could fully control. Paul, meanwhile, was becoming something no one had planned for. Not exactly the Kwisatz Haderach of the Sisterhood's ledger. Something both more and less than that design had specified. More because his prescient awareness exceeded anything the Reverend Mothers had modeled. He could see the deep future, not just the immediate probability space, but decades and centuries of it, a golden thread running through billions of possible timelines simultaneously. Less, because what he saw there horrified him. The Sisterhood had imagined the Kwisatz Haderach as a tool, a supremely powerful instrument that they would guide and train and ultimately direct toward the continuation of the program. But Paul Atreides was not a tool. He was a man who had been trained by his mother in Bene Gesserit discipline, by his father in honor and duty, by warriors in combat and strategy, and by Arrakis itself in survival. He had a moral center that the Sisterhood had not built into their design and could not override. He could see what they had made him into, and he could see what came next. He saw the futures that his existence made probable. And among all the branching paths of time, the most likely ones led to a religious war. A holy jihad fought in his name across the breadth of the known universe, fueled by the very myth the Bene Gesserit had seeded across generations with the Missionaria Protectiva. Billions of lives consumed in a fire the Sisterhood had lit 10,000 years before it burned. He tried to avoid it. He chose the path he believed was least catastrophic. But prescience, as he learned, was not a navigator's map. It was a tide. The more clearly he saw the future, the more certain pathways locked into place around him. The very act of knowing drew him forward. The jihad happened, and the Sisterhood had to reckon honestly with what their 10,000 years of patient work had actually produced. Here is where the question at the heart of the ledger becomes impossible to answer cleanly. Was the Kwisatz Haderach a success? The Sisterhood's stated goal had been to produce a being with full prescient awareness and the ability to access the complete spectrum of human ancestral memory, a tool they could use to steer humanity through what they understood in their own long view as a civilizational crisis point. The human species needed direction, needed steering, and they had appointed themselves the hands on the wheel. By the criteria of the breeding program itself, Paul was a success. The traits had converged. The prescience was real and overwhelming. The access to male ancestral lines was demonstrated. The male nervous system had survived what no male nervous system had survived before. The Kwisatz Haderach existed. But he was not controllable. He was not theirs. He saw through the program with the same clarity he brought to everything else, and he was not a willing instrument. Not because the goal of guiding humanity was wrong, but because the Sisterhood's assumption that they could manage a being of his power as they had managed everything else was, as he perceived it, catastrophically naive. Paul's reign as emperor ended when he walked into the desert blind. His physical eyes had been destroyed in an assassination attempt by Fremen custom requiring him to accept exile, and yet he could still see through prescience. He walked out into the sand in the old way, the way of a warrior who has lived past the purpose his world made for him and disappeared. His son would carry the burden further. The child of Paul Atreides and the Fremen woman Chani was Leto, the second. And if Paul was the Kwisatz Haderach, Leto was something the program had not even thought to imagine. Where Paul had seen the deep future and been paralyzed by the horror of it, Leto had seen it and made a choice so monstrous that it qualified by any ordinary human standard as an act of madness. He called it the Golden Path. The Golden Path was Leto's answer to the fundamental problem his father had identified and refused to solve. Paul had understood that the prescient ability he possessed was, paradoxically, a threat to the long-term survival of the species. A being who could see the future could control it. And a humanity that submitted to the vision of one supremely prescient ruler would lose the biological and psychological diversity required to survive across deep time. They would become a monoculture of the spirit, dependent, passive, unable to respond to genuine novelty because novelty had been planned away. The only cure, Leto believed, was a future in which prescience itself became impossible, where the spice was gone, where the navigators were gone, where the great prescient powers had burned themselves out, leaving behind a humanity so scattered, so enormously diverse, so thoroughly unmanageable, that no single vision could ever again claim dominion over it all. To achieve this future, he did something that should have been unthinkable. He bonded with the sand trout of Arrakis, allowing them to cover his skin, beginning a slow transformation that would over 3,500 years merge him with the planet's desert ecology. He became the God Emperor. He became the tyrant. He lived for those 35 centuries as a being that was neither fully human nor fully sandworm, a hybrid consciousness accumulating so much temporal data that ordinary prescience became something else entirely in him. An ecology of awareness rather than a window into time. And during those 35 centuries, the Bene Gesserit's genetic ledger passed into his hands. Not as metaphor, literally. Leto inherited the accumulated 10,000 years of careful documentation, the maps of bloodlines and recessive traits and calculated convergences. He understood it as he understood all things completely. He had access to Paul's memories and through Paul's other memory to Jessica's, and through hers back into the deep ancestral record of the sisterhood itself. He knew everything they had done, every manipulation, every marriage arranged, and every child guided toward a purpose they were never told about, every house infiltrated, and every planet seeded with myth. He saw the whole architecture of the program in a single cognitive sweep, and he used it. Not in the way the sisterhood had intended, but in service of his own far longer and stranger vision. He controlled the spice. He directed the sisterhood with an authority they could not resist, because he controlled the one thing on which all civilization depended. And for 35 centuries, the ledger continued. But now it served a different master with a different and darker purpose than any of its original architects had imagined. When Leto finally died, when the God Emperor fell from a bridge into a desert canal and his hybrid body was torn apart by the impact, releasing thousands of sand trout back into the ecology of the planet he had deliberately desiccated to maintain control of the spice, he left behind something remarkable. His death was not an ending. It was a detonation. The death of the tyrant triggered what became known as the scattering. The human species, so long constrained by his rule, exploded outward into the uncharted regions of the universe, in a diaspora so vast and so deliberately randomized that no prescient vision could ever again encompass it. This was precisely what Leto had designed. Not freedom as a gift, but freedom as a biological necessity. He scattered humanity across so much space and time and variation that the species became unpredictable, even to itself. And with the scattering, the Bene Gesserit's genetic ledger reached its final chapter. The bloodlines the sisterhood had so carefully cultivated and concentrated went out in all directions. The Atreides heritage, already dispersed through Paul's jihad and Leto's long empire, scattered further into the unknown. The specific genetic combinations the sisterhood had spent 10,000 years concentrating began to diffuse back into the broader human population. Like a single drop of pigment released into an ocean, still present in some form, but beyond any possibility of isolation or control. This was, from the perspective of the program's original architects, a catastrophe. Everything they had built was dissolving. But from the perspective of the Golden Path, it was the entire point. The sisterhood survived the scattering and adapted to it, changed in the process in ways the original Reverend Mothers would not have recognized. They encountered the honored matras, returning from the unknown regions, women who had taken certain Bene Gesserit techniques and transformed them into something darker and more violent. The conflict between these two groups of women, each claiming a different inheritance from the original tradition, consumed centuries of blood. And eventually, through conflict and necessity, a merger happened. The new Bene Gesserit that emerged from those wars carried within it something of both lineages, something the original program had not predicted and could not have planned. The final reflection on the Bene Gesserit's genetic ledger must reckon with this. They succeeded and they failed in a single gesture, and the two cannot be separated. They succeeded because the Kwisatz Haderach was real. Paul Atreides existed. The traits did converge. The male nervous system did survive and transcend the spice agony. The prescient awareness did manifest beyond anything a Reverend Mother had achieved. By the biological criteria of the program, the experiment worked. They failed because the thing they made was not a tool, it was a person. And persons, no matter how precisely engineered, have interiority. They have will. They have love and grief and the capacity to look at their own condition with clear eyes and choose something other than what was designed for them. Jessica chose love over the program, and in doing so, she created Paul a generation early and altered the entire trajectory of what came after. Paul chose death in the desert over the continuation of his role as the instrument of a prophecy he had never believed. Leto chose an act of deliberate self-transformation spanning 35 centuries because he decided that the continuation of prescient control over humanity was more dangerous than the chaos of genuine freedom. And Alia, the preborn daughter who was never supposed to exist, chose dissolution when the weight of all the ancestors living inside her memory became more than a human mind could bear. Every single key figure in the Ledger's long story made a deeply human choice that the program could not account for, because the program was designed by women who, for all their extraordinary intelligence and deep time patience, could not fully account for the fact that what they were building was not a better instrument. They were building better people. And better people are, by definition, ungovernable. The spice is the thread that runs through all of it. Melange, the substance secreted by the sandworms of Arrakis in their vast biological cycle, part of an ecology so ancient and alien that even the sisterhood's deepest ancestral memories could not fully trace its origins. The spice extended life and enhanced consciousness and enabled prescience and made interstellar civilization possible. Without it, the breeding program would have had no purpose, because the goal of the program was always to produce a being who could fully interface with what the spice unlocked. And yet the spice was never under the sisterhood's control. It was controlled by Arrakis, by the worms, by the ecology, by the Fremen who lived inside that ecology and had been shaped by it across uncountable generations into something the rest of humanity had not become. The most important variable in the entire 10,000-year experiment was a desert planet that the sisterhood could influence but could never own. There is a principle that runs through the Bene Gesserit's own internal commentaries, reconstructed from various sources across the long history. They understood that the danger to humanity was not external threat or scarcity or political chaos. Though all of those were real enough, the deepest danger was sameness, a universe in which every human choice could be predicted, every outcome controlled, every surprise eliminated by a sufficiently powerful, prescient authority, standing at the center of everything. They were building the very thing they feared most in order to create the conditions in which it could never appear again. That is not paradox. That is the logic of a sacrifice made across 10,000 years. A logic so long and cold and patient that it requires a certain kind of awe to hold it in the mind at all. Leto understood this. It was why he called his path golden. Not because it was beautiful or good by ordinary moral measure. It was golden the way a funeral fire is golden. Consuming everything in order to leave behind something that the fire itself could not consume. The genetic ledger of the Bene Gesserit is a document of 10,000 years of the most sophisticated long-range planning any human institution has ever attempted. It is also a record of unintended consequences so profound and so numerous that the original planners would barely recognize the universe their planning produced. Every Reverend Mother who added her observations to the living record, across the millennia, Every sister who endured a loveless placement in service of the program, every child born to fulfill a genetic role they were never told about, every noble house quietly manipulated, and every planet seeded with carefully engineered myths, all of it fed into a result that was simultaneously everything the sisterhood had worked for, and nothing quite like what they had imagined when they began. Perhaps that is the most human thing about the whole extraordinary story. We plan across generations. We work with patience that defies ordinary imagination. We construct frameworks meant to outlast our own lifetimes and our children's lifetimes and the lifetime of our civilization. And what we produce is always, in the end, something our plans did not quite contain. Something that overflows the vessel we so carefully shaped to hold it. The Bene Gesserit built toward the Kwisatz Haderach. They got Paul Atreides. They got Leto II. They got the Golden Path and the Scattering, and a universe that no prescient vision could ever again fully encompass or govern. And somewhere in that uncontrollable, unpredictable, ungovernable result, there is the answer to the question that drove the whole program forward from the very beginning. Can humanity survive itself? The Bene Gesserit's answer, worked out across blood and millennia and the lives of countless people who never knew they were characters in someone else's ledger, was yes. But only if it remains free enough to surprise even those who love it most. Only if it remains capable of choices that no program, however ancient and however wise, could have written in advance. The secret genetic records of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood are not a testament